The courtroom was packed, every seat taken as reporters. Lawyers and members of the public waited for what was supposed to be a routine hearing. The judge, an older man with neatly combed white hair and a stern expression, sat at the bench, his gavel resting beside him. He had presided over hundreds of cases, his authority unquestioned. But today, something was different. Today, the air was thick with tension, an unshakable feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, a 14-year-old girl who had been called to testify. She looked small standing there, her hands gripping the wooden railing in front of her, but her eyes held a quiet intensity. She had been through so much already, yet she refused to back down. The entire courtroom watched as she took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking. Her voice was clear, unwavering. "I know who did it," she said. A murmur rippled through the room. The judge narrowed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. "Miss Carter, please clarify," he said, his tone controlled but firm. Emily didn't hesitate. She lifted her hand, her finger pointing directly at the judge himself. Gasps filled the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The bailiff took an instinctive step forward, unsure of what to do. The attorneys exchanged shocked glances. Even the reporters, who had seen their fair share of dramatic courtroom moments, sat frozen, their pens hovering over their notepads. The judge's face remained still, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. He quickly composed himself, adjusting his posture. "That's a very serious accusation, young lady," he said, his voice measured. But Emily didn't waver. She stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent months trying to make sense of the terrible thing that had happened to her family. She had gone over every detail, every clue, every moment that had led up to this day. And now, standing in front of the most powerful man in the courtroom, she was ready to reveal the truth. The prosecutor, visibly shaken, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a short recess." "No," Emily interrupted. "You need to hear this. All of you do." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even those who had come expecting a normal legal proceeding now found themselves at the edge of their seats. The idea that a sitting judge, a man entrusted with upholding the law, could be accused of such a crime was unthinkable. And yet, the look in Emily's eyes said she wasn't making this up. The judge's fingers tapped against the desk, a small but telling sign of unease. "Miss Carter, accusations without evidence mean nothing in my courtroom," he said, though there was an undeniable tension in his voice. Emily reached into the pocket of her jacket, pulling out something small and metallic. She held it up for everyone to see. "Then how do you explain this?" she asked. The courtroom collectively leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The judge's expression darkened, and for the first time since the trial began, there was real fear in his eyes. The room erupted. Lawyers whispered furiously to one another, journalists rushed to take notes, and the bailiff stepped closer to Emily as if unsure whether to intervene. But nothing could overshadow the question now hanging in the air. Was the judge really the man behind it all? As the commotion continued, Emily stood still, her hand never lowering, her gaze locked on the man who had controlled this courtroom for years. Because she knew the truth. And now so did everyone else. The night had been long, but for Dr. Marcus Reynolds, it wasn't the exhaustion that weighed on him. It was the sting of what had happened. He had walked into the upscale restaurant, expecting nothing more than a quiet meal after a grueling shift at the hospital. Instead, he had been met with cold stares, whispered conversations among the staff, and finally, a blunt refusal of service. "Sorry, we're full," the hostess had said, her eyes darting to the nearly empty tables behind her. Marcus knew the truth. He had seen the hesitation in her voice, the way her gaze flickered with discomfort. He had spent years recognizing those subtle signals, the ones that told him he wasn't welcome, not because of anything he'd done, but simply because of who he was. He could have argued. He could have demanded to speak to a manager, pointed out the obvious discrimination. But he had learned over time that some battles were best fought differently. So without a word, he had turned and walked away. But he wasn't done. That night, as he sat in his apartment overlooking the city, Marcus thought about all the years he had spent proving himself. The long nights in medical school, the endless shifts at the hospital, the patients who trusted him with their lives. None of it had mattered in that moment at the restaurant. In their eyes, he was just another black man they didn't want inside their establishment. He wasn't angry, at least, not in the way people might expect. He was disappointed, tired. Tired of the way things still were, tired of the quiet racism that lurked beneath polished smiles and carefully worded excuses. But he wasn't the type to let something like this slide. The next morning, Marcus made a few calls. First to a journalist friend who had been looking for stories on discrimination in the city. Then to a few colleagues, people who had influence, people who cared. Finally, to someone who could make an even bigger impact, a well-known restaurant critic who had been eager to expose unethical practices in the industry. By noon, the plan was in motion. That evening, Marcus returned to the restaurant, but this time, he wasn't alone. He arrived in a sharp suit, his confidence unshaken. Behind him, a small group of professionals followed, doctors, lawyers, business owners, all people of color who had faced similar experiences in their lives. Among them was the journalist, camera discreetly tucked away, ready to document everything. As they stepped through the door, the same hostess from the night before was there. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for a split second, she hesitated. Then, glancing nervously at the manager standing nearby, she forced a tight smile. "Good evening, sir. Table for how many?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the silence hang in the air just long enough to see the nervous shift in her stance, the way the manager stiffened slightly, realizing this wasn't going to be a typical evening. "We were told last night that you were full," Marcus finally said, his voice calm but firm. "Yet I see several open tables now, just as I did then." The hostess swallowed hard. The manager quickly stepped in. "There must have been a misunderstanding. We'd be happy to accommodate you this evening." Marcus exchanged a glance with the journalist. He could see her already taking mental notes. "A misunderstanding," he echoed. "Then tell me, what was different about last night?" The manager faltered. Marcus wasn't here to cause a scene. He wasn't here to shout or demand apologies. He was here to make a statement, to show them, and anyone watching, that people like him weren't invisible. They weren't powerless. And the night was just getting started. The manager's forced smile wavered as he searched for the right words. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down on everyone in the room. Other diners had started to notice the exchange, their conversations quieting as they glanced over, some pretending not to look, others openly curious. Marcus kept his expression unreadable, but inside he felt the weight of this moment. He had been here before, in different forms, in different places, always being forced to prove something. His worth, his right to exist in spaces that should have been open to all. "We'd be happy to seat you now," the manager said, his voice smoother this time, as if hoping a calm tone would erase the night before. "Let's not have any trouble." Trouble. That word lingered in Marcus's mind, and he recognized it for what it was, a subtle warning, a polite way of saying they would rather avoid a scene, that it would be easier if he just accepted the table and let things go. But he wasn't here for their convenience. Before Marcus could respond, one of his colleagues, Dr. Elaine Carter, stepped forward. She was a respected surgeon with a presence that naturally commanded attention. "Let's be clear," she said, folding her arms. "The only trouble here is the way this establishment treated a paying customer last night. We all know what happened, so let's not play games." The journalist standing near the back scribbled something in her notebook. The restaurant critic, who had been quietly observing, tilted his head slightly, already evaluating how this would reflect in his upcoming article. The manager exhaled sharply, clearly understanding that this situation was slipping from his control. It was never about race, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "We had an unexpected rush, and we had to turn people away." Marcus arched an eyebrow. "Strange, because I distinctly remember seeing multiple open tables. And if it was just bad timing, why didn't anyone offer me a spot at the bar? Or suggest I wait?" The manager had no answer for that. Behind him, the hostess shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between Marcus and her boss. Her face was tense, but there was something else there too, guilt. And then, just as Marcus was about to press further, an unexpected voice spoke up. "I was here last night." The group turned to see a middle-aged white couple sitting at a table near the window. The man, dressed in a tailored suit, set his wine glass down and cleared his throat. We saw it happen. The restaurant wasn't busy. He was turned away the moment he walked in. His wife nodded, shifting in her chair as if unsure whether to get involved, but unwilling to stay silent. "It didn't sit right with us," she admitted. "We almost said something, but, well, we didn't." Marcus appreciated the honesty, even if it was late. Their confirmation made it impossible for the manager to backpedal any further. The silence in the room deepened. For the first time, Marcus saw the uncertainty on the manager's face give way to something else, concern. He wasn't just dealing with one man's complaint anymore. This was becoming a much bigger issue, one that could spill beyond the restaurant's walls. The journalist took a step forward, raising her phone. "Would you like to comment on this before we publish?" The manager's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what was happening. If this story spread, it wouldn't just be a bad review. It could ruin the restaurant's reputation entirely. The hostess, who had remained quiet up until now, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was told to say we were full." The words sent a ripple through the group. Marcus wasn't surprised, but hearing the confirmation still hit differently. The young woman avoided eye contact, staring at the floor as if ashamed. "By who?" Elaine asked, her tone sharp. The hostess hesitated, then glanced nervously at the manager. Marcus watched the way the manager stiffened, the way his expression darkened just slightly, enough to confirm what they all suspected. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a policy. The question now was, how deep did it go? And who else was responsible? The restaurant had fallen into a tense silence. The other diners, who had initially tried to act as if nothing was happening, were now fully invested. The manager's face had lost all traces of his forced politeness. His jaw was clenched, his posture rigid, and his eyes darted toward the hostess, as if silently warning her. Marcus saw it, the power dynamic, the unspoken pressure. He had seen it before, in different settings, in different ways. A lower-level employee forced to carry the weight of someone else's decisions, afraid to speak the truth. The hostess shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the edge of the podium where she stood. Her eyes flickered to Marcus, then back to the manager. For a moment, it seemed like she might back down, like fear might win. Then she inhaled deeply and spoke again. "He told me to say we were full," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But then she looked up, straight at Marcus, and her voice grew stronger. And it wasn't the first time. A murmur spread through the restaurant. The journalist's pen scratched furiously across her notebook. The restaurant critic, who had remained quiet up until now, let out a slow, measured breath. He had seen many things in the industry, but this was different. The manager's face paled. "That's enough," he snapped at the hostess, but his voice lacked the authority it had before. Marcus took a step forward, keeping his voice calm. "So how long has this been a policy?" The manager didn't answer. Instead, a man sitting near the bar, one of the restaurant's regulars, judging by the way he was dressed and how comfortable he looked, spoke up. "Yeah," he said, tilting his head. "Now that I think about it, I don't see a lot of black customers in here." Another diner, a woman in her 40s with a designer handbag resting beside her chair, nodded slowly. "I always thought this place had a particular kind of clientele. I just never questioned it." The weight of their words hung in the air. Marcus could feel the momentum shifting. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a pattern, a system, something bigger than one man being turned away from a meal. The journalist took a step closer to the manager. "Would you like to make an official statement before we run this story?" The manager swallowed hard, his confidence unraveling in real time. I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, but his voice was weaker now. "We welcome all guests." Elaine scoffed. "Except when you don't." The restaurant critic finally spoke. "I review places like this all the time," he said, his voice level but firm. "I've heard rumors, but this is undeniable." He gestured around the room. "People are seeing it with their own eyes." The manager's forehead glistened under the restaurant's warm lighting. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His gaze darted toward the back of the restaurant, toward the kitchen doors, toward someone. Marcus followed his eyes. And then a new figure stepped into the room. A tall man in a crisp suit, older, with sharp, calculating eyes. He walked with the air of someone who wasn't used to being questioned. The moment he appeared, the manager straightened, like a soldier standing at attention. This wasn't just any staff member. This was the owner. And from the way he looked at Marcus, it was clear he was not happy. The restaurant owner's presence changed everything. The nervous energy in the room sharpened, tension thickening like a storm on the horizon. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked onto Marcus with quiet intensity, sizing him up the way a businessman sizes up a threat. The manager, who had been fumbling through weak explanations just moments ago, suddenly stood a little taller, as if the man's arrival had breathed new confidence into him. The hostess, on the other hand, shrank back, pressing her lips together as if she already regretted speaking up. Marcus held his ground, refusing to look away. He knew this type well, men who built their power in quiet rooms, who made decisions behind closed doors and assumed they would never have to answer for them. The owner stepped forward, adjusting his cufflinks like this was just another business meeting. "Dr. Reynolds," he said smoothly, his voice even, controlled. "I'm sorry for any misunderstanding you experienced last night." There it was again. That word. Misunderstanding. Marcus let the silence stretch before answering. "I don't believe there was a misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady. "I believe there was a decision." The owner's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We don't discriminate here," he said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "That's not who we are." Marcus could feel the eyes of the other diners shifting between them, waiting, watching. Some were uncomfortable, clearly wishing they could go back to their meals. Others leaned in slightly, sensing something deeper at play. The journalist lifted her phone, suddenly recording. The restaurant critic folded his arms, taking mental notes. Marcus glanced at the hostess. She was looking at the floor now, her hands twisting together. If she spoke again, if she confirmed what she had already started to reveal, there would be no way for the owner to keep up this polished performance. The owner followed Marcus's gaze and must have realized the same thing. His expression remained smooth, but there was a shift in his stance, an understanding that the situation was teetering on the edge of something far bigger than a single complaint. Then, in a move no one expected, he turned slightly and addressed the other guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, I do apologize for the disruption," he said, his voice warm and practiced. "We pride ourselves on offering an exceptional dining experience, and I regret that tonight has been anything less than that. Your meals will be on the house." A murmur ran through the restaurant. It was a calculated move, a distraction, a way to shift the conversation from discrimination to generosity. Marcus saw the way some people immediately softened at the offer, nodding in appreciation. He wasn't surprised. Money had a way of making people overlook things they didn't want to deal with. But not everyone was buying it. The couple who had spoken up earlier exchanged a look. The man shook his head slightly, unimpressed. The woman bit her lip, conflicted but still watching the situation closely. Elaine, standing beside Marcus, let out a quiet laugh. "Classic," she muttered. "Throw money at the problem and hope it disappears." But the biggest shift came from the hostess. She lifted her head again, and for the first time, her expression wasn't just nervous, it was defiant. She had spent months, maybe years, following orders, convincing herself she had no choice. But now the truth was out in the open, and she had the chance to choose what kind of person she wanted to be. She turned toward the owner, her voice stronger than before. "So you're comping their meals, but you're not denying what you told me to do last night." The manager shot her a sharp look, but it was too late. The restaurant had gone silent again, the weight of her words settling over the room like a heavy curtain. The owner's jaw tightened just slightly, the first visible crack in his composed exterior. Marcus exhaled slowly, recognizing the shift. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about seeing what the owner would do now that everyone was watching. The restaurant was silent, the weight of the hostess's words pressing down on everyone. The owner's confident mask cracked, if only for a second. His fingers twitched at his side, his carefully controlled expression faltering as he realized there was no easy way out of this. Marcus didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. This wasn't his moment to take, it was hers. The hostess stood taller now, her voice clear and unwavering. "You told me to turn him away," she said again, her eyes locked onto the owner. "You told me to do it before. To do it whenever certain people walked in." A few gasps rippled through the restaurant. The owner exhaled sharply, like he had finally run out of patience. "I think you've said enough." But she wasn't done. "I quit." That was the moment everything shifted. The quiet hum of conversation that had been simmering in the background stopped completely. The journalist's camera was still rolling, capturing every detail. The critic's gaze flickered with interest. This wasn't just a review anymore. This was a scandal. The owner's face hardened. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. He looked around the restaurant, realizing that the usual power he held here, his name, his influence, wasn't working the way it always had. Then came the twist no one expected. The couple who had spoken up earlier stood from their table. "We won't be dining here again," the man said, pulling cash from his wallet and placing it on the table, refusing the free meal. His wife nodded in agreement, grabbing her coat. Another guest stood, then another. A ripple effect. One by one, people made their choice. Some left without a word, grabbing their belongings and walking toward the exit. Others muttered quiet disapproval as they paid their bills, wanting no part in whatever this restaurant had been hiding for years. The owner's face darkened. He turned to Marcus, his voice low but sharp. "Is this what you wanted?" Marcus met his gaze, calm and steady. "I wanted the truth to come out." The owner scoffed, shaking his head. "This will blow over," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "People forget." The journalist stepped forward. "Not this time," she said. "This story's already out there." The owner's eyes flickered to her phone, realization dawning. This wasn't just a bad night. This was going public. The manager, who had been silent for most of this, looked between the owner and Marcus, then at the customers walking out the door. He seemed to hesitate, something shifting in his expression. Then, without a word, he took off his name tag, set it on the counter, and walked out too. The owner stood alone now. Marcus exhaled slowly, then turned to the hostess. "If you ever need a reference," he said, his voice softer now, "I know people." She smiled, small but real. "Thanks." Marcus took one last look around. The restaurant, once a place that had tried to shut him out, now felt empty. Exposed. He turned and walked toward the door, stepping out into the night, knowing that tonight something had changed. Maybe not the whole world, but something. And sometimes that was enough. The cool night air hit Marcus as he stepped outside. The tension of the evening lingered in his chest, but there was something else too, something lighter. He hadn't set out to make a statement, but sometimes the truth had a way of pushing its way into the open, whether people were ready for it or not. Elaine walked beside him, hands tucked into her coat pockets. "Well, that was something," she said, glancing back at the restaurant. Through the window, they could still see the owner standing stiffly near the hostess stand, watching as more people left. His world had just shifted in a way he hadn't expected. Marcus exhaled. "Yeah," he said, running a hand over his face. He wasn't sure if he felt victorious or just tired. Elaine nudged him lightly. "You didn't just get a table tonight. You made sure no one else has to deal with that kind of treatment here again." Marcus thought about that for a second. He had been coming to restaurants like this his whole life, places where doors weren't always open, even when they should have been. He knew change didn't happen overnight, but maybe, just maybe, this was a step towards something better. A voice called from behind them. The hostess, well, former hostess, hurried outside, her breath visible in the crisp air. "Hey," she said, a little out of breath. I just wanted to say thanks for not letting it slide." Marcus shook his head. "You're the one who spoke up," he said. "That takes guts." She shrugged, glancing down at the sidewalk. "Guess I just got tired of being part of the problem." Then looking up, she smiled, small but real. "I think I'm gonna be okay." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, you will." The journalist stepped out next, still holding her phone. "That story's gonna hit by morning," she said. "People are gonna be talking about this." Elaine grinned. "Good." The journalist studied Marcus for a moment. "You know, I'd love to do a follow-up. Maybe talk more about your experiences, what this kind of thing means on a bigger scale." Marcus hesitated. He hadn't wanted to be in the spotlight, but he also knew stories like this needed to be told. "Let me think about it," he said. She nodded. "Fair enough." Then slipping her phone into her bag, she added, "Either way, this place won't be able to brush it under the rug." That's something. Marcus looked back at the restaurant one last time. The once bustling dining room was nearly empty now, the energy inside completely different from when he had first walked in. The owner still stood near the front, but now he looked smaller, less sure of himself. Marcus didn't need to go back in. He had made his point. As he and Elaine walked down the street, the tension of the night slowly began to fade. They hadn't planned for any of this, but maybe that was how change happened. One moment at a time, one person speaking up, then another. Elaine sighed. You hungry? Marcus laughed. Starving. She pulled out her phone, scrolling. There's a diner a few blocks from here. No reservations, no dress code, just good food. Marcus smiled. Sounds perfect. As they walked toward the diner, the city lights stretched out ahead of them. And for the first time that night, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. But tonight, in a small way, something had shifted. And sometimes that was enough.